Hezbollah, he said, will think 3 times next time before defying Israel. Because Hezbollah knows, you defy Israel, they'll go in, target the civilians, target the civilian infrastructure, and it'll turn the population against Hezbollah. And that's true. You shouldn't deny that, yes, it's true. They educated Lebanon not to defy Israel. And we should be clear, however, how they educated them. They used terrorism. And there's no point in denying that terrorism can work. It terrorizes populations into submission. And now Mr. Friedman says, what we really have to do is the same thing with Hamas. He says he was hoping that Israel was, quote, trying to educate Hamas by inflicting a heavy death toll on Hamas militants and heavy pain on the Gaza population. That's how you educate people. No Arab country left behind. Well, of course, Mr. Friedman can't come out and say he's carte blanche advocating terrorism, so he has to come up with a pretext. And he says, well, you know, Israel had no choice, because you know those demonic, satanic, Islamic fundamentalists, they're such cowards, they attach such low value to human life, unlike us in the West. He said, Hezbollah, and I'm using his words, they embedded themselves, nested among, and intertwined with the Lebanese civilian population. Israel had no choice. In order to get at Hezbollah, it had to kill the civilians, because Hezbollah was nested among, intertwined with, and embedded in those civilians. How many people have heard that claim about that nasty Hezbollah, the party of God? Raise your hand if you've heard that. Some of you must have heard it. Maybe you're suffering from paralysis of the armpits or something. Okay. Well, what does the record actually show? Here we have a fairly extensive record of what happened during that war. Let's, for example, take the study by Human Rights Watch, which is very far from a radical organization, and its record on the Middle East has always been quite wretched. But they did the study, and this is what they found. Let me quote. We found strong evidence that Hezbollah stored most of its rockets in bunkers and weapons storage facilities located in uninhabited fields and valleys. We found strong evidence that in the vast majority of cases, Hezbollah fighters left populated areas, civilian areas, as soon as the fighting started. We found strong evidence that Hezbollah fired the vast majority of its rockets from positions outside villages. We found strong evidence that all but a few of the cases of civilian deaths we investigated, Hezbollah fighters had not mixed with the civilian population. Not what you hear here in the West. Some of you are thinking, well, that's Human Rights Watch, they're liberal, you know, just look at their title. They believe in human rights. So, let's choose another study put out by folks who we can all agree don't believe in human rights. The U.S. Army War College put out a study on the Lebanon War, 2006 war, and it's interesting. It was based almost entirely on interviews with the Israeli participants in the war. Not Hezbollah, not Lebanese sources. They asked the Israelis, what did you see? And this is what the Israelis told the U.S. Army War College they saw. Quote, the key battlefields in the land campaign south of the Litani River were mostly devoid of civilians. And Israeli Defense Forces participants consistently report, listen, little or no meaningful intermingling of Hezbollah fighters and non-combatants. But it gets even worse. Nor is there any systematic reporting of Hezbollah using civilians in the combat zone as shields. It's all made up. Never happened. Using Lebanese as human shields, intermingling, nesting among, embedded in, intertwined with. It's all a myth. Well, Mr. Friedman makes a second claim. He says, what's Israel to do? He says, you know that Hezbollah, those cowards, rather than confronting Israel's army head-on, Hezbollah fired rockets at Israel's civilian population to provoke Israeli retaliatory strikes, inevitably killing Lebanese civilians and inflaming the Arab-Muslim streak. That's the claim. Israel was just retaliating. What's the record? The record is very clear. There have been numerous studies done. From 1992 to the end of the guerrilla war, even the Israeli generals acknowledge Hezbollah never targeted Israeli civilians in northern Israel until Israel first targeted Lebanese civilians. There's no dispute in that, on that point. And the same thing happened in July 2006, when Israel started to target Lebanese civilians. Hezbollah said, you target our civilians, then we're going to target yours until you stop. The technical term for that is called belligerent reprisals. Namely, if you violate the laws of war, we're going to violate them until you stop violating them. You can make an argument, I'm not going to quarrel with you, you can make an argument that the targeting of civilians under any circumstances is immoral, and that belligerent reprisals are under any circumstances immoral. Okay, there's an argument there. That happens not to be what international law says. There is no absolute prohibition in international law against belligerent reprisals. You can check on your own in the International Committee of the Red Cross Standard Handbook on International Law. They make it clear there's no absolute prohibition. But leaving that aside, the important point, I think, is to get cause and effect right. It's not that Hezbollah targeted Israeli civilians and then Israel retaliated. It's just the reverse. As Nasrallah said in the third day of the war, he said that Hezbollah would target Israeli civilians, quote, as long as the enemy undertakes its aggression without limits or red lines. So long as they cross the red lines, we will. When they stop, we'll stop. So, if Israel targeted the Lebanese civilian population and infrastructure during the 2006 war, it was not because it had no choice. It obviously did have a choice. They could have simply fought the Hezbollah troops or fired on the Hezbollah rockets, which were not intertwined with, intermingled with, or nested among the civilians. And they didn't do it. They didn't target civilian infrastructure and population because Hezbollah had provoked them, because it was Israel who fired first. So why did they do it? Because terrorizing the civilian population was a relatively cost-free method of education. It was much to be preferred over fighting a real foe and suffering heavy casualties.